Last week I was talking to you about love, and I realized after I finished and I was working, having my devotions during the week, there were some things that God wanted to kind of go into some more. So I'm going to sort of delve into a little bit deeper in some areas. But basically, I want to just start by giving a little bit of a review if you weren't here last week, or just to remind you. I'm going to draw some pictures. This is sort of like a chalk talk, you know. I'm an artist at heart, you can tell. So human love is basically reciprocal love. So you love this way and they love back. And as you develop a relationship, as the relationship grows, the level of sharing gets deeper and deeper, and so that keeps going back and forth. And everyone, it's perfectly natural, it's perfectly human. We need love in order to exist. You have to have love coming in. And in order to get love coming in, you need to have love going out. And so as you send love out, then hopefully it comes back in. And I mentioned last week that sometimes in relationships that sort of gets lopsided, and so one side might be giving love a lot more love than the other, and that can be really frustrating. And so there's this intense desire to want to shift them up so that the levels are the same. And sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't happen. But it's the reason that we have conferences, the reason that we have all kinds of books on relationships, on communication, on getting along together, because we want this to be equal. We want love and receiving love to be somewhat on the same par, and we want there to be constant flow of that, because we feel inadequate if we're not loved. We feel life's not worth living. It's one of the most important, essential things that we have as humans is to be loved and to give love. And so there is this back and forth that happens. And let me just say that if you're in a relationship where you're the one that's doing more loving, it's probably not a good idea just to point that out. I can make some suggestions as to how that can help, and we're going to talk about some other things that will help in that area. But and what typically happens when that relationship is going that way is that this person becomes somewhat resentful, and they start becoming more critical. The relationship seems to be falling apart. And even if things are the same, you know, if there's this back and forth, there is a plateau that happens somewhere around here. I'm going to have to switch colors because that's dead. How do you like green? A lot of people, when they get to this plateau, they become disillusioned with the relationship. And that plateau usually happens around 8, maybe 9, 10 years, somewhere in there. And statistically, that's when the vast majority of divorces happen, between 8 and 12 years. And because they've sort of got this plateau and there doesn't seem to be any more new things happening, and they're tired of constantly giving, and maybe feel like, it never feels like you get the same amount back, even if you're at the same level. It always feels like you're giving more than you're getting. And so there's this little frustration. So there's this sense that people have that, you know, if I just give up on this and start all over again, it'll be better. It never is. Statistically, second marriages are rarely better than the first. But that's the sort of the feeling that we have that maybe that will help. So this is where we are with human love. And I mentioned last week, just sort of briefly, that there is another level. Oh, let me say this first, that God's in here too. So let me just put God in here. G for God. And God's role in love is not to make people love you. Let me just make very clear about that. If that gorgeous person across the room, I don't care how hard you pray, God's not going to make them fall in love with you, all right? So that isn't how that works. God is a resource to give us the ability to know how to love people. And so when you pray to God, you don't pray that they will love me. You pray that God help me to creative love them. Help me to see them in ways that I can love them better. And so God can enrich this back and forth. And especially if both people are praying and they're saying, God, help me to love that person better, God can have a significant role in making this really a rich and a great reciprocal relationship. Now I want to talk to you about another level of love, which is up here. And I mentioned it just somewhat briefly last week. And this is a type of love which is not human love. This is something which I would say was divine love, and it's not something which we normally have. But I want to tell you a little bit more and focus on that. In order to do that, I want to look with you at the book of Hosea. And Hosea was a prophet in the Old Testament. And he would have existed somewhere between 600 and 700, somewhere in there BC. And you can turn there if you want. It's toward the end of the Old Testament, right after Daniel. So if you find the book of Daniel, it's just after that. If you get to Hosea, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, those are after him. Hosea. So before I talk about Hosea, let me just say something about prophets. Prophets are really important to the church, but it's also really important that the church doesn't have a lot of prophets, because prophets tend to see things as very black and white. Everything to a prophet is, this is how it is. You can draw a line, and this is the way you go. And there's no that way, it's all this way. Prophets aren't known for having a lot of mercy, the gift of mercy. They more often have the gift of maybe discernment. And as I say, they see things black and white. And when the authors of the Bible wrote their books, God didn't take away their personality. He didn't just suddenly make them into something that they aren't. They write from who they are. And so there is a lot of prophetic words in the book of Hosea, and some of them you may find kind of disturbing, but keep in mind that Hosea is a prophet, all right? And he sees things from a prophet's perspective, and that's how he is reporting this incident. So the story starts with God telling Hosea that he's supposed to go and take a wife. Now, you understand that in that culture, you didn't fall in love with someone and marry them. Marriages were arranged. And his parents didn't arrange this marriage. God arranged it. And he said, I want you to go and marry a promiscuous woman. Let me just read this passage to you. Start at verse 2. Then the Lord began to speak through Hosea. The Lord said to him, go and marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her. For like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And bore him a son. Then the Lord said to Hosea, call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre of Jezreel, and I'll put an end to the kingdom of Israel. So she has this first son, and then she has a daughter, and then she has another son. And understand that Hosea's relationship to her is arranged, and it is obviously down here. Okay, there's no divine love in this relationship. It is an arranged marriage, and he went and he made this bargain with her. She's a woman that's not married. She's a promiscuous woman, prostitute, and so she's looked down upon society. She has no place in society, and so Hosea is offering her a home. He's offering her some stability. He's offering her a name. He's offering her hope for the future, but it isn't implicit in that he's offering her love. He's just offering her all these other things. And because he's being obedient to the Lord. It's not because he's fallen in love with this beautiful lady. He's just obeying God, and he's doing this. And so what immediately begins to happen, and so they're together for long enough to have 3 kids, however long that is. Could be 3 years, it could have been 5, 6 years, we don't really know. But they're for a while. And then something happens to Gomer. She becomes very frustrated and disillusioned with her life. And it says in chapter 2, from here on, we're into a lot of imagery, okay? So he's telling the story, but he's doing it through the words of a prophet. So when a prophet wants to tell a story, he uses lots of imagery and lots of creative ways to express his heart. But you can see in this, if you read between the lines, that Hosea is really hurting. He's really, really painful because she's abandoned him and abandoned their children. And it says in verse 3, their mother has been unfaithful. She's conceived them in disgrace. She said, I will go after my lovers who give me my food, my water, my wool, my linen, my olive oil, and my drink. And so here, Hosea is suddenly realizing that this wife that God has given to him has abandoned him. She's left. She's gone back to her former lifestyle. Now, from her perspective, from Gomer's perspective, understand that simply becoming the wife of this prophet didn't probably help her all that much. Because Hosea was prophesying to Israel, the northern kingdom. They were an incredibly ungodly nation. They had no interest in God, no interest in hearing God's word. So he wasn't a popular person. He was probably spending a lot of time going around village to village proclaiming these words that nobody wanted to hear. And he's preaching God's judgment if they don't repent and turn back to God. And so she's home alone, and not only is she home alone without a husband most of the time probably, but even when she is there, the society she's living in probably doesn't feel any better about her than they did when she was a promiscuous woman. So she's in a very, very difficult place, and she becomes so discouraged, so disheartened. And I'm reading somewhat between the lines and somewhat putting my own interpretation into this. But she finally says, this is worse than my old life. I'm going back to it. So she goes back and begins living with another man. Then God begins to work on Hosea in his heart and says, now you need to start to learn to love this woman. And you need to love her the way that I love you. And so in chapter 3, it says that the Lord said to me, go show your love to your wife again. Though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress, love her as the Lord loves Israel, though they turned to other gods and loved their sacred raisin cakes. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver, which is a tremendous amount of money, and about a homer and a lectha of barley, which I think is about 450 pounds, so a huge amount of grain. And then I told her, you are to live with me many days. You will not be a prostitute or be intimate with the other men, and I will behave the same way toward you. So Hosea suddenly is transforming from this type of love to this type of love. And this type of love begins to see people as God sees them. And I mentioned this last week, but it begins to view people not through their faults, through their weaknesses, through their failings, but through the way that God truly intended them to be. And this love, in order to have this type of love, there are some things that have to happen in your heart. See, this is natural. Your brain is wired for this, okay? You're born wired to have love this way. You are not wired to have love this way, because this type of love begins to love people without expecting love to come back. In fact, it gets so strong that eventually you thrive on the giving of love rather than the receiving love. Down here, you love because you need to be loved. Your heart needs that. But when you move to this level of love, you actually thrive not on the receiving of love, but on the giving of love. This, I believe, begins with the loving of yourself. And Janelle had an interesting story that I wanted her to share with you. So go ahead and tell that story about what happened to you. It should be on. Is it on? It's on. You're good to go.
All right, I was at work 3 weeks ago, and my boss had asked me, two numbers didn't work. And the reason they didn't work is someone the night before had put the product out and it had sold. But I went out in the hallway, and I all by myself, and I said, I hate this. I hate this. I hate not knowing why this isn't working and inconveniencing my boss and assuming that I was the one that was the incorrect one. And God brought me right up, and he said, do you really know what you're saying here? He's saying, I hate you for not knowing the answer. I hate you for being wrong. And And then the thought came to me, and how can you be so cruel to yourself? It was huge. And then the next thought that came to me was, and this is going to change. And it's rather freeing because I'm not assuming that I'm the wrong one. I'm not assuming that I'm the one who has to make it right. And it is, it's challenging, but it is so cool to know that I'm worth it, that I'm worth loving, and that I may not necessarily be the one that's wrong. So, thank you.
Thank you. I grew up with this, what I call the worm theology, and I have a bit of an issue with that because I think there's a difference in loving yourself and being conceited or being arrogant. I think, in fact, those typically are not signs of loving yourself, but really of not loving yourself. And so you put those things forward because you really do not like who you truly are. And God says that you need to love your neighbor as yourself. So loving yourself doesn't mean that you're arrogant or conceited. It merely sees yourself as the amazing, wonderful thing that God created you to be. It's acknowledging your gifts. It's acknowledging who you are. It's being able to look in the mirror and say, I like that person. I like who they're growing to be. I like how they are loving other people. And that requires a mind transformation. It truly does, because your whole life you've been said that's not right. You're not supposed to think that way. And so you have to have your mind transformed. You have to have your mind changed to be able to love yourself. And as much as you can love yourself, you'll begin to love other people without feeling the need for them to love you back. So that's the central key in all this. And so what happened in Hosea's life is that he began to move up into this area. He began to see his wife for all of her value, for all of her truth, not for all of her shortcomings, for all of the wonderful things that were about her, for the children that she'd given to him. And he could do that because his mind had been transformed from this way to this way. Now, there's one other part of this that I just want to mention. And this is an advantage that we have because of the cross and the resurrection. And, we are considered followers of the cross. We are considered followers of Christ who rose from the dead. And those two acts provided us with a connection to God that was not possible in Hosea's time. We have the ability to have God's Spirit literally come into our hearts and to literally transform us. So there may be some work that you simply need to do that's psychological work that you could find in any psychology book, any workbook or whatever, that begins to transform your thinking as far as learning to love yourself and to love other people without reciprocity. But there's also another level of yielding to the Spirit of God and saying, God, transform me. I probably told you this story before, but when I truly met God for the first time in the jungles of Ecuador, I suddenly was filled with a love of those people that I did not have before. It was supernatural. And God can do that for you. There are people around you that you think, I could never love that person. God can supernaturally transform your thinking to where you can begin to love those people and not have any need whatsoever of them loving you back. Not only those people that are hard to love, but you will love the people you love even better. And this is what will happen. These people that are like this, as you start loving them from up here, you'll start pulling them up. God will start pulling them up. Because for the first time, they're being loved in a way they've never been loved before. And they want to respond, and they will start responding. They will transform them, and you will transform other people as God begins to transform you. I want to transition to communion, because communion is the celebration. It's the ritual, in a sense, that we do that celebrates this incredible access that we have to God and to His Spirit. And communion is open to everyone. Wherever you are, wherever place in your faith is, you can use it as a connection to God that you haven't had before. And we recognize two different elements: bread and the juice, which probably should be wine, but we use grape juice. And our bread's all gluten-free, just in case you're wondering. But I want to invite the elders to come and to help me to serve. And Bob, can you help us too? Dwight. So think about the words of Christ. And he said, "This is my body which is broken for you." And maybe the bread this morning can represent a new view of your body, a new view of yourself. God, transform my mind to see myself the way that you see me. You made every cell in my body. You made the things that don't work right. My eyes don't work right. I have some other things going on in my body, but God made me that way. And I want to be able to appreciate and love the uniqueness of everything there is about myself. So use this bread as a commitment for God to transform your thinking about yourself.